The first thing Victoria Langford said that morning was, "Those animals are lowering property values." She said it with a smile that looked polished enough to belong on a campaign poster. The smell of fresh hay drifted across my pasture while the sunrise painted the fences gold. My two guard alpacas barely looked up from breakfast. They had heard louder voices than hers. The gravel crunched beneath expensive SUV tires as 3 HOA board members stepped onto my driveway, carrying clipboards like they owned the county. I stood there holding a feed bucket with dust clinging to my boots after another ordinary morning on Caldwell Farm. Nothing about that sunrise hinted it was about to cost someone millions of dollars. Victoria unfolded a stack of violation notices with dramatic precision. She claimed my alpacas violated community aesthetics, insisting they frightened joggers, and even arguing their humming noises disrupted neighborhood tranquility. I almost laughed because Jasper and Oliver spent most mornings quietly watching over my sheep without bothering anyone. They had never crossed a property line, damaged a fence, or chased a single resident. Yet somehow they had become the greatest emergency Willow Creek estates had ever faced. "You have 48 hours, Victoria announced. "Remove them or we'll begin enforcement." She sounded proud of the phrase, like she had rehearsed it in front of a mirror. One board member photographed the pasture from every angle. Another measured the distance between my fence and the road with a laser device. The entire performance felt absurd. The scent of fresh-cut grass mixed with expensive perfume while someone typed notes into a tablet as though documenting a national disaster. My nearest neighbor, old Mr. Dawson, leaned against his mailbox across the road and slowly shook his head. He knew those alpacas better than most people knew their own dogs. Jasper had once chased a coyote away from his goats during a winter storm. Oliver had stood beside frightened children after a school bus broke down near my fence until help arrived. Around here, they were quiet guardians. To Victoria, they were unacceptable decorations. I signed. Nothing. I argued about nothing. I simply accepted the envelope she handed me and wished everyone a pleasant morning. That seemed to irritate her more than any shouting ever could. She expected anger. She expected threats. Instead, she watched me pour another scoop of feed while Jasper calmly rested his long neck against my shoulder. "You'll regret ignoring this," she warned before climbing back into her spotless white SUV. Maybe she believed that. Maybe everyone standing beside her believed it too. They drove away convinced they had just bullied another farmer into surrender. They never asked why two guard alpacas lived behind reinforced fencing. They never wondered why every gate carried weathered monitoring tags that looked like ordinary maintenance markers. And they certainly never imagined that one ridiculous complaint about neighborhood appearances had already set something much bigger in motion. I have lived on that land for almost 18 years. Every fence post carries memories instead of paint. Every oak tree marks another season my father and I spent rebuilding the ranch after storms rolled through central Texas. My grandfather bought the property in 1968 when nobody wanted rocky pasture outside town. Back then, the nearest paved road sat nearly 3 miles away. He always believed land should earn respect before it earned money. I grew up hearing that sentence almost every weekend. The smell of cedar after a spring rain still reminds me of his old work gloves. When he passed the ranch to me, he left behind something much more valuable than acreage. He left a promise that we would never sell it to developers no matter how many offers arrived in the mailbox. That promise became easier to keep than most people expected. I never wanted a mansion. I never wanted expensive cars. I wanted quiet mornings and healthy livestock. Jasper and Oliver became part of that life almost by accident. A neighboring rancher had too many young alpacas after expanding his breeding program. He told me they were intelligent, calm, and surprisingly fearless around predators. I decided to give them a chance. Within weeks, they proved every story true. Coyotes stopped testing my fences. Stray dogs learned to stay away. My sheep rested easier. Even the deer seemed less nervous crossing the pasture at dusk. The soft humming sounds the alpacas made became as familiar as the wind moving through tall grass. Children from nearby farms sometimes waved from passing trucks just to see them standing proudly beside the flock. Nobody complained. Nobody felt threatened. At least nobody until Willow Creek Estates expanded toward my property line. New houses appeared one after another as fresh concrete replaced open fields, slowly changing the air from the scent of wildflowers to the smell of fresh asphalt and lawn fertilizer. Then came matching mailboxes, decorative stone entrances, perfect sidewalks, rules for everything. The subdivision kept growing until my ranch looked like the last piece of old Texas trapped inside a sea of identical rooftops. I stayed exactly the same. They changed around me. At first, the relationship remained peaceful. New neighbors stopped by to buy fresh eggs or local honey. Some even asked questions about ranch life because their children had never seen livestock before. Then Victoria won the election for HOA president. Almost overnight, ordinary conversations turned into official notices. Fence colors became community concerns. Tractor noise became schedule violations. Dust from my gravel driveway somehow became an environmental issue. Every month, another letter arrived with another complaint that had never existed before. I answered politely every time. I followed county law because county law was the only authority that applied to my ranch. That answer never satisfied Victoria. She believed every property surrounding her subdivision should eventually follow her rules whether they belonged to the association or not. The strangest part was how little she actually knew about my land. She never asked why reinforced fencing protected only one section of pasture. She never questioned why unfamiliar utility trucks occasionally appeared before sunrise and disappeared before lunch. She simply assumed I was another stubborn rancher refusing to modernize. That assumption would become the most expensive mistake she had ever made. Because while she spent her mornings measuring grass height and mailbox colors, other people had been quietly measuring something far more important on my property for years. The certified letter arrived exactly 2 days later. It rested inside my mailbox like it weighed 100 pounds, even though it was only a few sheets of paper. The morning air smelled like fresh coffee drifting from my porch. Jasper lifted his head the moment I walked toward the fence. Oliver stayed close behind the sheep with the same quiet patience he showed every sunrise. I opened the envelope while standing beside the pasture. The paper crackled in the breeze. The language inside sounded more dramatic than a courtroom movie. Immediate compliance, daily penalties, forced removal, legal recovery of enforcement costs. Every sentence carried the same message. Victoria believed she could simply pressure me until I gave up. By noon, another vehicle rolled into my driveway. This time it was not the HOA board. It was a private livestock inspector hired by the association. He climbed out with a clipboard and an uncomfortable expression. I could tell within seconds he knew something about ranching. He studied Jasper. He watched Oliver circle the flock without making a sound. He finally lowered his clipboard and quietly admitted there was nothing dangerous about either animal. He even complimented their condition before driving away. I figured that would end the matter. I underestimated Victoria's determination. The following morning, new warning signs appeared along the subdivision fence facing my ranch. Beware of aggressive livestock. Parents keep children away. The signs made no sense because the nearest walking trail sat almost 300 yards from my pasture. Families had safely watched the alpacas for years. Still, fear spreads faster than facts. By the weekend, neighborhood social media pages exploded with rumors. Some claimed the alpacas were imported attack animals. Others insisted they carried rare diseases. One post even suggested they had nearly chased someone into traffic. None of it was true. Nobody ever produced a photograph. Nobody filed a police report. The stories simply grew larger every day. Victoria encouraged every one of them. She organized what she called a community safety meeting at the clubhouse. A neighbor who still had enough common sense to question the nonsense later told me she stood in front of a projector showing enlarged photographs of Jasper and Oliver like they were dangerous fugitives. She claimed property values could collapse unless immediate action was taken. She spoke about preserving the community image. She spoke about protecting families. She never once mentioned county regulations. She never mentioned my ranch existed decades before her subdivision. 3 days later, I heard engines outside before breakfast. The familiar rumble echoed across the pasture. 2 pickup trucks stopped beside my entrance. Behind them sat another white sport utility vehicle wearing the Willow Creek Estates logo on both front doors. Victoria stepped out wearing pressed khaki pants and spotless boots that had clearly never touched real mud. She carried another folder thicker than the first one. This time she smiled before saying a single word. That smile worried me more than any threat. She announced the board had voted unanimously to begin emergency compliance procedures. According to her latest interpretation of the rules, The association now intended to arrange removal of my alpacas if I refused to cooperate. I calmly asked one simple question. Under what legal authority? She answered without hesitation. Community Protection Authority. It sounded impressive until you realized no such authority existed outside her imagination. I thanked her for delivering the notice. I folded the papers. I slipped them into my jacket without another word. Victoria looked almost disappointed. She wanted an argument. She wanted raised voices and angry headlines. Instead, she watched me refill the water trough, while Jasper quietly followed beside me. As the vehicles disappeared down the gravel road, my phone vibrated once inside my pocket. The message contained only 5 words. Documentation received. Continue normal operations. I smiled for the first time all week because someone far beyond the HOA had already started paying very close attention. Monday morning arrived with low clouds hanging over the pasture. The air smelled like wet cedar and fresh soil after an overnight drizzle. Jasper stood near the front fence watching the road with unusual focus. Oliver stayed beside the flock as if he sensed visitors were coming before I did. At exactly 8:15, 3 county vehicles rolled into my driveway. None of them carried federal markings. None of them belonged to law enforcement. The first truck belonged to Animal Services. The second came from the county code office. The third carried a local television crew that somehow knew exactly where to park before anyone stepped outside. Victoria climbed out behind them wearing another carefully pressed outfit that looked more appropriate for a ribbon cutting than a farm. She greeted the camera before she greeted anyone else. Her smile widened the moment the reporter pointed a microphone toward her. She spoke about public safety. She spoke about responsible neighborhoods. She spoke about difficult decisions that leaders sometimes have to make. Listening to her felt like watching someone read from a script written long before arriving. The county officer approached me with a polite handshake. He introduced himself as Daniel Harper. I had met him years earlier during a fencing permit inspection. He quietly admitted someone had filed repeated emergency complaints demanding an immediate investigation. He also admitted every complaint described a different situation. One claimed dangerous livestock. Another claimed illegal breeding. A third alleged environmental violations. None of them matched what stood directly in front of him. Daniel walked the pasture without rushing. He checked every fence. He examined water supplies. He watched Jasper calmly guide a curious lamb away from an open gate. He looked toward Victoria after nearly 30 minutes and slowly closed his notebook. I could see the disappointment on her face before he even spoke. He politely explained there were no visible county violations requiring emergency action. The television reporter lowered her microphone. That should have ended everything. Victoria refused to let the moment disappear. She reached into her folder and produced another packet of documents. She insisted the association had independent authority to protect neighborhood interests regardless of county findings. Daniel calmly reminded her that private association rules stopped at the subdivision boundary. She answered by accusing the county of ignoring public safety. The conversation remained professional. The tension came from pride instead of raised voices. Around us, more neighbors gathered along the roadside. Some stood quietly with coffee cups. Others whispered while watching Jasper and Oliver graze without the slightest concern for the audience surrounding them. The contrast almost felt humorous. 2 peaceful alpacas stood in complete silence while a room full of adults searched for reasons to fear them. Before leaving, Daniel handed me his business card. He spoke quietly enough that only I could hear him. He said every inspection from that morning would become part of the official county record. He also suggested I keep copies of every future notice that arrived from the association. I thanked him and slipped the card into my wallet. Victoria noticed the exchange immediately. Her expression hardened for only a second before she recovered her polished smile. She turned toward the television camera one last time and promised the association would continue pursuing every legal option available. Then the convoy slowly drove away. The reporter followed without getting the dramatic footage everyone expected. The only sounds left behind were birds returning to the fence line and the soft humming of Jasper greeting Oliver across the pasture. Later that afternoon, another message appeared on my phone from the same unknown number. It was only 1 sentence long. County documentation confirmed. Phase 1 is complete. That was when I realized the people quietly watching this situation were allowing every unnecessary decision to be made without interruption. Someone wanted the entire story preserved exactly as it happened. And Victoria kept providing better evidence with every passing day. 3 quiet days passed without a single vehicle stopping at my gate. The pasture settled back into its familiar rhythm. The smell of sun-warmed cedar drifted across the hillside every afternoon. Jasper and Oliver returned to their usual patrols as if the entire dispute had already been forgotten. I almost believed the county inspection had convinced everyone to move on. Then Thursday morning arrived. I heard a different engine before I saw the truck. It was not another county vehicle. It was a dark, gray government pickup with plain license plates and no official markings anywhere on the body. The driver stepped out wearing jeans, work boots, and a weathered jacket that looked ordinary enough to disappear into any crowd. He carried no clipboard. He flashed no badge. He simply walked toward the pasture with calm, deliberate steps. Jasper noticed him first. Instead of keeping his distance, he calmly approached the fence and stood perfectly still. Oliver did the same a few seconds later. The visitors smiled in a way that suggested they recognized each other. That was not something strangers usually experienced. He looked toward me and quietly said, "Their behavior remains exactly as expected." Hearing those words after nearly 4 years caught me completely off guard. I nodded without offering any explanation. We spent the next 20 minutes walking the pasture in complete silence except for the wind brushing through dry grass. He examined fence sensors hidden beneath wooden rails. He checked several small monitoring stations disguised as ordinary utility boxes. Everything appeared exactly where it should have been. Before leaving, he handed me a plain envelope without any official markings. Inside rested a single folded document and an updated authorization card with my photograph. Nothing else. No dramatic speech. No explanation. He simply looked at me and said, "Your reporting requirements remain unchanged." Then he returned to his truck and drove away. Unfortunately, someone else had been watching from much farther down the road. By lunchtime, Victoria had already convinced herself she had uncovered some secret conspiracy. She appeared outside my entrance again. This time she arrived alone, carrying a camera with a long zoom lens. She spent nearly half an hour photographing every government vehicle tire mark left in the gravel. She photographed utility boxes. She photographed fence posts. She even photographed the mailbox at my front gate. I stayed on the porch drinking coffee while watching the entire performance unfold. She eventually marched toward the property line with obvious confidence. "Who was that man?" she demanded. I answered honestly. "Someone conducting official business." That simple reply irritated her far more than any detailed explanation ever could. She insisted homeowners deserved to know whether suspicious government activity threatened neighborhood safety. I reminded her that my ranch was private property and that official visitors were not required to explain themselves to the homeowners association. Her face tightened. The polite smile disappeared. Before leaving, she announced the board would immediately begin an independent investigation into what she called unauthorized government operations. I almost admired the confidence behind that statement. She genuinely believed her authority reached wherever her curiosity happened to wander. That evening, another envelope appeared inside my mailbox. Unlike every previous notice, this one did not come from the association. The return address belonged to a federal office located hundreds of miles away. Inside was only one sentence printed across the center of the page. "Continue maintaining normal daily activities. Do not interfere with ongoing documentation." I folded the letter and placed it beside the others in my desk drawer. Outside, the last light of day settled across the pasture while Jasper and Oliver quietly watched the distant subdivision from the hilltop. They looked completely peaceful. They had no idea that a simple argument about neighborhood appearance had quietly crossed into territory far beyond anything Victoria could possibly control. Saturday morning began with the sharp smell of fresh coffee drifting across my porch and the distant sound of lawn mowers coming from the subdivision. Everything looked ordinary. That illusion lasted until a black sport utility vehicle rolled slowly onto my driveway without any agency. Logos on the doors. A second vehicle followed behind it. Then a third. None of them activated emergency lights. None of them made a scene. For people stepped out wearing plain clothes and simple windbreakers. The only thing that stood out was the calm confidence in the way they moved. The man I had met earlier walked toward me first. This time he reached into his jacket and quietly displayed a federal credential before putting it away again. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell," he said. "We are ready to conclude our review." I nodded once and invited them onto the porch. Jasper and Oliver remained in the pasture, completely relaxed, almost as though they recognized the visitors from years before. One of the agents smiled when Jasper walked directly toward the fence and calmly stopped a few feet away. Still the best behavioral response in the program, she whispered while making a note on her tablet. That single sentence explained more than weeks of rumors ever could. The lead agent opened a secure folder and spread several documents across my porch table. Some carried federal seals. Others contained maps of my property that reached back more than a decade. The oldest agreement bore my signature from 4 years earlier. After my father passed away, I had quietly accepted a partnership with a livestock guardian animal evaluation program. The project focused on livestock security, predator management, and rural infrastructure resilience. Jasper and Oliver were registered evaluation animals assigned to a long-term livestock guardian field study. Their assignment focused on evaluating practical livestock protection methods under real ranch conditions. My property had been selected because of its location, history, and surrounding wildlife corridors. Everything had been approved through lawful agreements that remained active. The reinforced fencing, the monitoring stations, the occasional government vehicles before sunrise. None of it had been random. Every inspection, every visit, every quiet report served a documented purpose. The lead agent closed the folder and looked directly at me. "You have remained fully compliant throughout the agreement," he said. "Unfortunately, another party has not." He handed me a second file several inches thick. Inside rested photographs taken by the association itself, copies of their warning letters, social media screenshots, recorded statements, certified complaints. Every attempt Victoria had made to interfere had unknowingly built a perfect timeline. They had documented their own actions more carefully than any investigator could have requested. I finally understood why every message had instructed me to continue normal operations. Nobody needed me to argue. Nobody needed dramatic confrontations. The evidence had been gathering itself one unnecessary decision at a time. Before the meeting ended, the lead agent asked one final question. "Did you ever authorize the Homeowners Association to inspect federal monitoring equipment or interfere with protected program operations?" "No," I answered. He simply checked a small box on his form and closed the folder. That tiny mark carried more weight than Victoria could possibly imagine. As the agents prepared to leave, I noticed movement beyond the entrance gate. Across the road, Victoria stood beside her white sport utility vehicle with binoculars raised toward my porch. She looked convinced she had finally uncovered the secret she had been chasing for weeks. She had no idea the truth was much worse for her than anything she had imagined. She believed she was watching an ordinary meeting. In reality, she was watching the final piece of evidence fall into place. Monday arrived with a strange kind of silence. The subdivision usually woke up with delivery trucks, lawn crews, and garage doors opening one after another. That morning, the only sound drifting across my pasture was the steady breeze moving through dry grass. The air carried the familiar smell of cedar and warm earth. Jasper stood on the hill overlooking the neighborhood, while Oliver calmly watched the flock below. Around 9 o'clock, another convoy appeared at the entrance to my ranch. This time the vehicles did not stop at my gate. They continued directly toward the Willow Creek Estates clubhouse. Plain government sport utility vehicles parked neatly along the curb without flashing lights or dramatic entrances. Men and women wearing business attire stepped out carrying briefcases instead of clipboards. They looked more like accountants than investigators. That alone made me realize the difficult part had already happened. The lead agent called me a few minutes later. His voice remained as calm as ever. "We have officially opened administrative proceedings. You are not required to attend." I thanked him and ended the call. There was nothing else for me to do. Everything had moved beyond my involvement. Around lunchtime, several neighbors began gathering outside the clubhouse. From the ridge above my pasture, I could see small groups talking quietly while legal representatives entered the building one by one. Victoria arrived almost 20 minutes late wearing another carefully tailored outfit and carrying the same oversized folder she had brought to my ranch so many times before. She walked with complete confidence. She still believed she was the person asking questions. Less than an hour later, the atmosphere changed completely. More government vehicles arrived. Several county officials joined the meeting. Then representatives from the Agricultural Protection Program entered carrying sealed document cases. The conversations outside suddenly stopped. Nobody laughed anymore. By mid-afternoon, rumors spread through the subdivision faster than summer wildfire. One homeowner drove to my mailbox pretending to check directions. He quietly asked whether everything was going to be all right. I simply smiled and said the truth usually takes longer than gossip. He nodded without another word before driving away. Shortly afterward, my attorney called. Unlike most people, he had known about the federal partnership from the beginning because every agreement had been reviewed through his office years earlier. His tone remained completely professional. The association created far more exposure than anyone anticipated, he explained. Their written notices, recorded meetings, and public statements established a clear timeline of repeated interference after multiple warnings. Every additional action expanded their potential liability. I asked one simple question. How serious is it? He paused for several seconds before answering. Serious enough that several insurance carriers may refuse coverage if the findings remain unchanged. That answer said everything. The Homeowners Association had spent weeks trying to remove two peaceful animals over neighborhood appearances. Now the very organization responsible for protecting property values faced the possibility of losing the financial protection that allowed it to function. By sunset, another certified envelope arrived at my mailbox. This one did not come from Victoria. It came directly from the association's legal counsel. Inside was a formal request asking me to preserve every document, photograph, message, and notice connected to the dispute. They no longer demanded compliance. They requested cooperation. The difference between those two words was enormous. I placed the letter beside the growing stack inside my office. As darkness settled across the ranch, I watched lights flicker on throughout the subdivision. Behind those windows, dozens of homeowners were finally asking questions their board had avoided for weeks. Nobody was talking about alpacas anymore. Nobody cared about neighborhood aesthetics. They wanted to know how a simple complaint had somehow attracted federal agencies, county officials, attorneys, and investigators. The answer was remarkably simple. Victoria never lost because of two guard animals. She lost because she believed authority existed wherever she decided to exercise it. And by the time she discovered the limits of that belief, the entire system she controlled had already begun collapsing under the weight of its own decisions. The real consequences arrived 1 week later. They did not arrive with sirens or dramatic speeches. They arrived inside certified envelopes thick enough to make every mailbox in Willow Creek Estates feel heavier than usual. The morning smelled like fresh rain on gravel. A light breeze rolled across the pasture while Jasper and Oliver quietly followed the flock toward the northern fence. From my porch, I could see homeowners walking from house to house carrying identical legal packets with confused expressions. Nobody smiled anymore. Nobody measured grass height. Nobody talked about community appearance. They talked about liability. They talked about insurance. They talked about emergency meetings with attorneys. By noon, the clubhouse parking lot overflowed with vehicles. Homeowners demanded answers that Victoria could no longer provide. The association attorney spent nearly 3 hours explaining the situation behind closed doors. Later that afternoon, one board member quietly drove to my ranch. His shoulders sagged as though he had not slept in days. He apologized for participating in decisions he admitted he never fully understood. I accepted the apology because anger would not change anything now. He looked across the pasture at Jasper and Oliver before shaking his head. All of this happened because of them, he whispered. No, I answered. All of this happened because people stopped respecting limits. He stood silently for several seconds before returning to his truck. 2 days later, the financial impact became public. The association's insurance carrier issued a reservation of rights notice while reviewing whether repeated actions outside the board's legal authority remained covered under the policy. Contractors paused several neighborhood improvement projects until funding questions could be resolved. Scheduled road resurfacing stopped. Landscaping contracts entered review. Reserve funds became locked pending legal guidance. Property owners who had never cared about two peaceful alpacas suddenly discovered that governance mistakes carried very real costs. Then another surprise surfaced. During the federal review, investigators discovered several association directives had instructed contractors and inspectors to approach areas clearly marked as restricted monitoring zones. None of those attempts caused physical damage. They did create documented interference with an active federal agricultural protection program. Every letter, every meeting minute, every public statement became another piece of evidence. The paper trail stretched back for weeks. Victoria had documented almost every decision herself. One Friday afternoon, I received another phone call from my attorney. His voice sounded almost amused. "You remember the emergency compliance fines they threatened against you?" I laughed quietly. Hard to forget. He explained that the association had officially withdrawn every notice, every assessment, every demand for removal. They also submitted written confirmation that my property remained completely outside their jurisdiction. The same board that once insisted it controlled my ranch had now signed documents admitting exactly the opposite. During the legal review, homeowners discovered something that had never appeared in a single HOA meeting. My family trust still owned the land easements supporting the subdivision entrance and several utility access corridors. That fact had never mattered until the association decided to challenge property it did not control. Every maintenance agreement the association depended on had required our annual consent for years. We had quietly renewed those agreements without ever asking for recognition. Still, the largest consequence had nothing to do with me. Homeowners began filing internal petitions demanding leadership changes. Independent financial audits were requested. Several board members resigned before the review even concluded. Victoria attempted to defend her decisions during a community meeting. According to neighbors who attended, she argued that she had acted in good faith to preserve neighborhood standards. Nobody applauded. Too many families had already received notices explaining that legal expenses could affect future association budgets for years. The irony settled over the neighborhood like evening fog. A campaign that began over the appearance of two quiet animals had placed the financial stability of an entire homeowners association under enormous pressure. The neighborhood now faced potential legal exposure measured in millions of dollars. Rebuilding trust had become far more important than enforcing cosmetic rules. That evening I walked the pasture one last time before sunset. The smell of fresh hay filled the air. Jasper gently nudged my shoulder while Oliver watched the horizon exactly as he had every evening since arriving on the ranch. Nothing about their routine had changed. Everything around them had. Sometimes the greatest disasters never begin with storms or fires. Sometimes they begin with someone believing that power belongs to whoever speaks the loudest. The law has never worked that way. It never will. Autumn arrived quietly across the ranch. The morning air carried the scent of dry grass and cedar, while a cool breeze rolled across the hills that my grandfather once called the last honest corner of the county. Jasper and Oliver wandered through the pasture exactly as they had every day before this entire ordeal began. They never understood why strangers had become so obsessed with them. They only knew their job was to protect the flock. In the end, they never stopped doing exactly that. Willow Creek Estates looked different now. The entrance monument still stood beside the road, but the atmosphere had changed completely. New board members had been elected after weeks of community meetings. Independent audits became standard practice. Every proposed rule faced careful legal review before anyone dared enforce it. Homeowners who once ignored board meetings suddenly filled every seat because they had learned how expensive blind trust could become. Victoria was gone. Her resignation arrived before the final administrative reviews concluded. I never celebrated that moment. There was no satisfaction in watching someone lose the position they had fought so hard to control. The real lesson had never been about winning against one person. It had always been about reminding everyone that authority has boundaries. A month later, the lead federal agent returned one final time. This visit lasted less than 15 minutes. He shook my hand beside the same fence where our first quiet conversation had taken place. He confirmed the field program entered its next operational phase, and my ranch was no longer required as an active monitoring site. The reports gathered from my ranch would help improve livestock protection projects across several western states. He thanked me for keeping every agreement exactly as promised despite the unnecessary distractions. Before leaving, he looked toward Jasper and Oliver grazing beneath the old oak trees. "They did good work," he said with a smile. I looked at the two animals standing peacefully against the golden hillside and quietly answered, "They always have." A few weeks later, the monitoring stations disappeared one by one. The reinforced sensors hidden beneath the fences were carefully removed. The occasional service vehicles stopped arriving before sunrise. For the first time in years, my ranch belonged entirely to ordinary ranch life again. I almost missed the quiet routine of those early morning inspections. Almost. One Saturday, Mr. Dawson walked over carrying a homemade peach pie, still warm from the oven. We sat on the porch watching the flock drift across the pasture while the smell of cinnamon mixed with fresh coffee. He laughed softly before asking the question everyone else had wondered for months. "Did you ever think about telling them the truth from the beginning?" I smiled into my coffee cup. "Nope." He raised an eyebrow. "Why's that?" I looked toward the subdivision where children now occasionally waved at Jasper and Oliver through the fence exactly as they had years before. "Because the truth means very little to someone who has already decided they know everything." He nodded without another word. The silence between us felt comfortable. Looking back now, people sometimes assume the story was about two guard alpacas. Others believe it was about a homeowners association that forgot where its authority ended. They are only seeing part of it. The real story began the moment someone confused confidence with legal power. Every warning letter, every public accusation, every unnecessary inspection became another brick in a wall they built around themselves. I never needed to push it over. They finished building it on their own. My grandfather used to tell me that patience is the strongest fence a person can own because impatience always finds a way to climb itself. Standing there today with the smell of fresh hay in the air and the sound of peaceful animals grazing across the same land my family protected for generations, I finally understood exactly what he meant. Justice does not need to shout. It only needs time. And sooner or later, time always finds the truth.